Hey everybody, this is Matt from Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, and today I'm going to be doing something that I've wanted to do for a really long time, and that is start a countdown of my top 100 fantasy books of all time. And I'm going to be doing this in chunks of 10. So today I'm going to be doing number 100 down to 91, and then a week from now I'm going to be going down a 10 by 10 by 10 till eventually we get to our top 10. Now keep in mind before we begin that I really love all of the books on this list, and it was really hard for me to narrow this down to a top 100. I have read hundreds and hundreds of fantasy books. So this is the cream of the crop. So if you find something at the bottom of this list, don't think it's because I don't like it. I love that book, just not as much as some of the other ones on here. So let's begin, why don't we? So starting at number 100, this is Avempartha. This is the second book in Riyria Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan, and this was written in 2009. And so when Riyria Revelations began, this is the story of Hadrian and Royce, and they're kind of commonly referred to as like one of the best fantasy buddy duos that exists. You've got Hadrian and Royce, who are total opposites in the sense that one of them is that classic strong man, like a brute, can destroy everything with his swords that he has. And one of them is a thief. And they get along so well, and the dynamic that they play off each other is really what keeps, I think, a lot of readers coming back to this series, is that amazing relationship between these two. Now, don't get me wrong, the stories are good, but it's these two characters that really sell everything home. The first book in this series I thought was okay, but the second book, for me, is where the plot really starts to take shape. This is where the larger plot of the Heir of Navron and the mystery that surrounds it really starts to take hold. Not just that, I think the story itself was magnitudes better than the first book in this series. And this is one of my favorite Riyria books that have ever been made. There's been a lot of them. There's got to have been way over a dozen of these books. And we'll talk about some of those later on. But you know, I did think that the first third of this book was rather tedious, and I was worried. I'm like, why do people keep raving about this series? You know, the first book was okay. The first third of this book is just straight not good. But then it just lit off like a firecracker. It's so good. The story really develops into kind of a classic tale of these guys getting hired to take down a monster. And I don't really want to say much more of that because I want to keep this rather spoiler-free. But the entire story is about this greater mystery going on, and it ties into this mythical beast that they're in charge of taking down that seems impossible because of how monstrous this thing is and how these are just two regular guys. So thoroughly enjoy that book. I did find that there was some boring aspects to the story as they got later on, but it does pick up here and there, and we'll talk about another one later on in this list. So let's go to number 99, and this is Going Postal. This is part of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, and this was written in 2004. I thought that this was the best plot of any Discworld book, and there have been many dozens of Discworld books made, so that's quite the claim. I did not think that this was the funniest Discworld ever made, but the plot was so amazing. It got kind of philosophical at times, which a lot of Terry Pratchett books does. And this is one of the books that I recommend to people to read if they've never been into Discworld before, even though this book is written way later on in the series. Discworld is kind of famous for having a lot of subplots. It's got 4 or 5 major storylines that you don't want to jump into them randomly. You want to read that first part of the miniseries, if you'll use that term, and begin from there. But this starts a new series way later on in the story of a man called Moist von Lipwig. And this guy is just a con artist, and he's very entertaining. And the basic premise of the story is he is given another chance. I believe he's going to be executed at the start of the book, but he gets the king, or I don't think it's a king, but the guy who's in charge of the city says, look, I'm not going to kill you, but I do want you to go run the post office. And it's this new kind of thing, and he goes in to say, let me see what I can do. And as he gets in, it's just extremely comical, and literally every single room is filled from floor to ceiling with letters that have not been mailed off. And you have to like swim through the place to be able to get from point A to point B. So it's the story of him trying to create a functioning post office as it's competing against what is the clacks, or what is the telegraph. And in this new era of the world, and he's kind of representing this old era, and it's just such an amazing story. It is longer than the other Discworld books. I don't know this for a fact, but based on me just reading along, it felt like about 100 pages longer than almost any other Discworld book, maybe like 50, but it felt quite a bit longer. But it served itself so well. I thought just an amazing story that I think everybody should give a shot. And if you've never read Discworld before, this is a great book to jump into. So 98. And this is going to be Artificial Condition, part of the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells, and this was written in 2018. This is the first Murderbot story, and ultimately, it's my favorite Murderbot story, because Murderbot is such this unique story that I've never read anything like before. I've certainly read a lot of sci-fi. I've read a lot of robot stories, which go hand in hand with sci-fi, but I've never read a robot story quite like this one. You've got Murderbot, who is this, clearly he's a robot, but he's become sentient. He's taken out his governor module that is supposed to control who he is, but he doesn't want anybody to know this because he knows that he'll be decommissioned if they find that out. So he's trying to play along like he's still this normal robot, but he has all these complex feelings. It's written in the first person, so everything is from Murderbot's perspective, and he is this deeply human robot. In fact, has a better character and more human-like qualities than a lot of human people that are in other books. It's extremely well done. It's quite funny. I did think that the series wanes in how funny it is later on in the series, because it doesn't really develop as a series as much as I would want. It's just kind of the same old Murderbot, and some of the ways that it does develop goes in not the direction that I'd want. But this first book, it just really blew me away for how good it was and how short it was. I have a bias towards longer, like epic fantasies. These huge, 1,000+ page books. In fact, the longer the better for me, with pretty much no cap on that. If you were to create a book that was entertaining in a couple thousand pages, I would be all over that, because it's just longer that I get to enjoy this story and this world that's been placed. Murderbot is short. It's like, I feel like 150 or so pages. You get through these things in like a day, maybe 2 at most. And if you're not a fast reader, you'll probably still do the same, because it's entrancing what this story is all about. Murderbot is very insecure, and he's got always doubting himself, and he's very shy. He wants more than anything just to be by himself and to watch TV. It's very much, I think a lot of people can relate to that, more, withdrawn personality type that doesn't want to be around people, and that's certainly Murderbot. So really fun story, unique, and I certainly, like all these books, I would recommend it to anybody, especially those that are into sci-fi and enjoy kind of a more quirky story and something new and fresh. So number 97, and this is going to be an extremely controversial take, and this is The Two Towers. This is part of The Lord of the Rings, written in 1954 by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's my least favorite of the Lord of the Rings books. I still liked it a lot. I really love this story. I love the story. I love the movies. I love everything about this, but it just wasn't quite up to what the other ones were. And I think a lot of middle book syndrome, maybe it doesn't actually have that, but I perceive that a lot of stories like this. I'm very biased towards loving, oftentimes, the first book in a series, because it sets the world. It captures my imagination, and I don't know what to expect. And I love that not really understanding everything yet feeling. And I do really love the ending of a story, especially when it's done well. More than anything, I love a beautiful finish. But the middle can be tough sometimes. But, there's so much that I loved about this book. I loved, and I don't think this spoils anything. And I don't know if I can possibly spoil it for the people that are watching this, because everybody's read this or watched the movies or knows the plot line. But the Ents, these human-like trees, these gigantic trees, was a joy, not just in their story arc, but the way that they're written and the way that they're portrayed, I'm in love with these guys. They're probably my favorite characters in the entire series. So every aspect of the scenes that they're in, I absolutely cherished. You know, I thought that the adventure that Merry and Pippin go on when they're with the orcs and they're captured, you know, I thought was extremely entertaining. I love that part of the book. And this is where Gollum really gets introduced too. And I'm a sucker for Gollum. I love that character. I find him deeply compelling, probably the most compelling character in this entire series. And I find the series can have characters that lack that compelling factor in some ways, because of the way that the book is written and how old it is. It's hard for me sometimes to connect with these characters. I certainly connect with the world. The world building is, you know, a 6 out of 5. But the characters can be a little bland for me, but not Gollum. He's written so well, and I love that character arc. I really love this book, and you're going to hear about the other books in this series later on as I do these videos. So, to number 96. This is another Discworld book, and this is The Last Continent. This is by Terry Pratchett, obviously, and written in 1998. This was the 22nd book in the series, and my favorite of the Rincewind books. Rincewind is this wizard, a rather bad wizard. And he's, like all Discworld books, there's a lot of comedy involved in it and, you know, some deeper level thinking. But the Rincewind books are about this wizard who stumbles into success. And, you know, his main motivation is to run away from bad things. He does not ever want confrontation. He doesn't know how to do magic. If he does, it's on accident. But he's just this constant goofball. But the Rincewind side of the story was not my favorite part of the story. What really made this story show up on my top 100 was the other plotline of the story. And this is the other wizards that are part of the academy. And they get stuck on an island, a very small island. And the dynamic that these characters go through in engaging with each other is hands down the hardest I have laughed in any Discworld book. You know, I out loud was, you know, very audibly laughing through major stretches of this book, not just here and there, but for pages and pages in a row. It's just deeply entertaining. And quite frankly, every time that it shifted over back to the Rincewind perspective, I was like, oh, I want to go back to seeing what these wizards are up to. Because, you know, my favorite part of Discworld is characters conversing with each other. It's not so much the plot lines, which I do enjoy. It's not so much the deep philosophy, which I do enjoy. But it's the dynamic between the characters is so well done. And I could read an entire Pratchett book with no real plot going on, just characters talking to each other, and that would be one of my favorite things that I could ever conceive of reading. And this book really had it in spades. So hugely recommend this book. And it's a book that I find is very often overlooked. You know, a lot of people talk down on this book. They say it's one of the weaker Discworld books. I heard that I should skip this one unless I'm really into like Australian culture. No, don't skip it. It's awesome. Read The Last Continent. So number 95, and this is Promise of Blood. This is part of the Powder Mage by Brian McClellan, written in 2013. This is the first book in the Powder Mage trilogy. There's been 2 trilogies in the Powder Mage, and you know, I thought the first trilogy was much better than the second one, and this started everything out. You're going to hear the other books in this trilogy later on in this series, but you know, I loved the foundation of this story, laying out this multi-POV, and I love a good multi-POV, huge epic fantasy book, which is what this is. This is my introduction to what they call a flintlock fantasy. Flintlock fantasy, think of like Napoleonic era, with people literally shooting like gunpowdered muskets. That's the backdrop of this story. It's not like a medieval background. It's this, you know, Napoleonic era type stuff. And it's very well done. I suspect that there's other books that have done this, probably books that have done this before then, but this is my introduction and I loved it for that. The characters in this story are so wonderful. Think the First Law when you're thinking of this series. There's a lot of differences, but when I've recommended this book to people, I say, if you really like the First Law, I think that you'll at least like this book, if not love this book, because it has so many similarities. You know, it's got multi-POV, it's got incredible characters, it's got great dialogue, it's got a huge scope that it's trying to cover, these major epic deeds, funny writing. The world building is just top notch. You know, I liked in this book that it had one of those fun, like, traitor plots. You don't know who the traitor is and you're trying to figure it out all through it. It's not necessarily just a mystery book. It is truly an epic fantasy, but it does have these mystery components to it. And the magic system is so fun. These characters, certain characters can be born with certain traits. And one of the major things that people can be is they can literally snort gunpowder, and it gives them all these crazy abilities. They're faster, they're stronger, they can see further, and more importantly, they can shoot a gun with incredible dead-eye accuracy from way far out. It's not overused in the story, just like the First Law. I don't think the First Law relies on its magic system to tell a great story. Neither does this one. But yeah, if you have not read The Powder Mage, please get on it. It's an underrated series. One of the most underrated fantasy series of all time, in my opinion. So, number 94, and this is going to be Morning Star. This is part of the Red Rising Saga by Pierce Brown, written in 2016. And this is a sci-fi book, but I do find it to be have a lot of fantasy elements as well. This is my favorite of the Red Rising series books. This is the last in the trilogy. And I was getting disillusioned with this series as I went into this book. I did not love the first book. I disliked a lot of it. I felt like it was trying to borrow so much of other books that have succeeded, and it didn't do its own thing so well, and I didn't love the writing. The writing was so, to the point and didn't go into depth. You know, it didn't have this nice prose to it. It was so matter of fact. Short, quick sentences. The pacing felt off in the sense that it was always trying to be so fast. You know, I like a story that slows down and tells me about these characters more, that book just didn't do. I thought the second book was better. You know, not incredible, but good. Enough to get me interested in the third book. And the third book blew my mind with how good it was. The ending of the book in particular, you know, I did think the whole book was good, and I won't ruin anything, but it wraps up this story in incredible fashion. You know, if I was ever to do a video of my favorite endings to a fantasy series, this would be very high up on that list. It blew my mind. You know, I love books that when I expect them to zig, they zag. And that's what this book did constantly at the end. I had no idea how this ending was going to go. I thought I did, but I got slapped across the face at a reality check that I really needed and I loved, and it cemented the series as a very good one for me. Now, I'm not a big fan of the follow-up trilogy. I DNF'd it after the first book, but this one is amazing. So, gotta check it out. So, down to number 93, this is Percepliquis. This is another book in Riyria by Michael J. Sullivan, written in 2011. And this is the last of the 6 books in the Riyria Revelations. And like you can tell, we're going to see a lot of that in this series, that I love a final book in a series. And this is another one that will go up there, is one of my top endings of all time. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the story here because, you know, I don't want to ruin anything. But I became deeply disillusioned with the story, and I really didn't know if I was even going to get to this final book. I started to like the books less and less after that second book. I thought that there were some good aspects to it that I kept reading, and the thing that really kept me coming back was the 2 main characters, like I mentioned earlier. They're so well written. I love that dynamic. I love best friends in a story. It's one of my favorite tropes in fantasy, and this one does it so well. You're going to hear a couple other buddy duos that show up later in these series that I think are a little bit better than this, but I love Hadrian and Royce. But this ending, oh my gosh, I had no idea how this was going to go. And the author did this beautiful thing where they had this secret that they didn't want the reader to know. And they slapped it on at the very end of this book, and they could have done it so much earlier. But the author didn't. And I cherish Michael J. Sullivan for hiding it from the reader for so long so that it could have such a bigger impact when it finally happened. And when it happens, maybe some people saw it coming. I certainly didn't. I was completely shocked in a good way. I want to be shocked. I've read so many fantasy books that I can see a lot of things coming. So when I get shocked, it's my favorite feeling when I'm ever reading a book. And this book certainly had that in spades. So let's go to number 92, and this is Stonewielder. This is part of the Malazan universe by Ian C. Esslemont, written in 2010. Now, a lot of you that may be watching this are going to say, Ian C. Esslemont, who's that? Steven Erikson writes Malazan. Yeah, he does. But so does his friend 𝐿 Esslemont. They, together with a group of friends, developed this series when they were younger, playing a Dungeons and Dragons-y type game when they made their own world up called Malazan. And while Steven Erikson became very popular for his 10 books, Malazan Book of the Fallen, 𝐿 Esslemont is amazing in his own right. And he writes books in the same universe with a lot of the same characters telling different stories. In this series, Novels of the Malazan Empire, this is a series where, he does this beautiful thing for me in that he goes and tells these stories of offshoots of the main story that for me as a reader, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, what it does is it keeps things real for me. It will tell a story, but it doesn't try to wrap up everything so cleanly. You'll see characters go off and do their own thing, and the story just moves on without them. And, it's such a different feeling as a reader, and you're like, man, I'm used to all the ends being tied up in a book. And that's not what you should get into Malazan to hear about. You should go into Malazan feeling like, I have faith that the ending is going to deliver, and that the story is taking me at its path, and I just have to trust that it's going to move there, even though major characters and storylines may just end. And you just have to trust that, I guess this book wasn't really about that. Well, this series takes up a lot of those loose ends and tells its own story. Or, a continent will be described, because Malazan is not a continent or 2 or 3 or 4. It's a world with many continents that have their own distinct cultures and peoples and events that shaped what they are. And that's why it's my favorite series of all time. But there's continents, entire continents, that are just briefly mentioned in Book of the Fallen that I'm like, man, I wish I could hear about that. Well, this book is one of those books where it goes to an entirely new continent, and it tells some amazing stories. It rivals a lot of the main Malazan books for me in Book of the Fallen. It's not quite up there, but it's really high up there. I'll tell you about a couple of the things that really captured my imagination without spoiling things. But one of them is the Storm Wall. And the Storm Wall is this enormous wall that's built on the northern part of this continent. And it is protecting the continent from the Storm Riders. And what the Storm Riders are is they are this mythical race of people, and that I think they might be made out of ice, or maybe it's not described, in my mind it's ice. And they come up out of the sea, and they literally ride waves. And when they get on the waves kind of turn into these horse-like looking creatures, and they try to break through the wall. And so they're trying to crash on top of it and literally fighting the defenders that are on this wall. And the defenders, most of them, are not there willfully. They are prisoners that have been captured. They're chained to a portion of the wall until you will defend this wall or you will die. And it's just an amazing story that goes along with it. But that aspect of the story just captured my imagination in an amazing way. And I love that it went into depth on that story because I loved it. The other one is Greymane. Greymane is this disgraced, I think he's what you would think of as like a general. That's not what they call them in these books. They call them fists or high fists. But he has been disgraced. But he has been tasked with going back to this continent to take it over. There was a previous group of Malazans that went to the island, but they turned renegade. And he has to go fight against them, fight against the natives, and try to succeed in taking over this continent. And it's a really fun story that delves into all the different factions that are involved here in a very complex, classic Malazan way. So I can't say enough good things about Stonewielder. So the last book in this part of my 100-book series is going to be number 91. And this is The Blade Itself. This is part of the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie, and this is written in 2006. This is the book that started the First Law. It's the first book in the series, and man, it does such a good job at setting the scene. It is very slow, though. Don't expect a ton of action. Now, I can appreciate that, especially out of a first book in a series. I want things to slowly lay the groundwork for an amazing story down the line. Now, books that do go too slow, sometimes they never pick up in the following books, and it lets you down. Not this one. This one goes off to a roaring second book and third book and beyond. But I love the foundation building that happens here. I will suggest, though, and I'm not going to say this often, that you listen to this in audiobook, not read the book. I have done both. The audiobook is far superior. The narrator for this book, I forget his name, is incredible. Not just the voices that he does, which are amazing, but the inflection that he puts on, the passion that he puts into this story, he elevates it in so many ways, to the point where I can't think of these characters without thinking of the unique voices that this actor puts into it. They're so good. You know, I read a lot of audiobooks, not as much as physical books, but I do, you know, probably about a quarter to a third of the books that I read are in audio format. And a lot of them are good, but you know, you can clearly tell it's the same voice actor, just doing a little differences each way. Not this one. It feels like there's 10 different voice actors. That's how good it is. Now in this series, the characters in this series I find to be the most compelling as any characters in any fantasy story, especially two of them. One is Sanden Glokta. He is a former war hero that's a cripple by the start of this book, but he's turned into a torturer. He is an evil, evil man that, because he's so well written, you can't help but kind of root for this guy. And it's a weird feeling, rooting for somebody that has almost no positive traits about them, but they're so well written and deeply, you know, he puts so much compassion into the way that he writes these characters that you're rooting for this horrible person. And I'm normally a guy that I want to root for the good guys. There's not a lot of good guys in this story. There's a lot of shades of gray. This one is almost pure black, and I love him for it. Another amazing character, and one that you'll constantly hear people refer to, is a guy named Logan Nine Fingers. He's got 9 fingers. He is this bleak character that used to be the toughest guy in the North, and kind of has tried to retire. He wants to be a better person, but people keep trying to pull him back into his past life, and he is. They never fully explain it in the series, I don't think. Maybe they did and I don't remember it, but he has this alter ego personality, and that when he gets too angry, he turns into the Bloody Nine. This raving lunatic that cannot be stopped, who can destroy anybody or anything or hordes of people. And it happens routinely throughout the story. And it's some of the most like chilling reading you'll ever do when he turns into this other person. And all in all, The First Law is one of my favorite series of all time, and this is where it started. So those are my first 10 that I want to do. Let me know your thoughts. What did I get wrong? What should have been way higher? What shouldn't have been on this list? I want to hear it from you. So thanks so much, and you will hear from me next week with number 90 through 81. Thanks for watching, and happy reading to you.